Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Page One podcast. I'm Marco.
I'm Tarek.
And thanks for joining us at the Page One podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds, authors, screenwriters, comic book writers, video game writers, about their writing process, how they broke into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips as possible. We've got a great catalogue of guests now, so please do check out the previous episodes. And we have another great guest this week. In fact, our 50th guest, even though this is episode 51, because Richard Morgan was split over 2 episodes. This is our
Richard.
This is our 50th guest this week. And who is it, Tarek?
We are chatting this week to the wonderful Joe Abercrombie, who is very well known in the fantasy genre world. Mm-hmm. His First Law Trilogy, which is The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings. That was quite a big deal when it came out back in 2006. I think.
Yeah.
Really, really big fantasy stuff, but a lot of humour.
Yeah, it's very sort of. Well, in the interview, Joe uses the phrase tongue-in-cheek, but that might give you the wrong impression, I think, of some of it. I mean, it's proper, big fantasy plots and things like that, but the characters just seem a bit more real, I think, than sometimes maybe what you're expecting if you say the word fantasy. They don't have that po-faced seriousness that I think a lot of fantasy can have.
Yeah, it moves very much away from that Lord of the Rings kind of like cliche that you see a lot, and it's and even Game of Thrones, it's much more fun.
Which Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones are great, and they're their own thing. But I think this is it is a fresh voice. I think it's a different take on it.
Absolutely.
And and it was a lot of fun speaking to Joe as well. You can tell where that sort of
the voice comes from.
Dry sense of humour comes from. We speak to him about how he got the Blade itself published, which again, as usual, isn't your typical write a query letter to an agent story.
No.
And then since then he's been pretty prolific, and we speak to him about that as well, about the fact that there are certain fantasy authors that kind of get stuck in telling their long stories, and the fans get on their back and stuff. But Joe, thus far, hasn't had that problem, and he's released 2 trilogies set in that world. He's also got a young adult trilogy as well as some standalone novels. So he's been very prolific since The Blade itself first came out. So we will not waste any more time. We'll get straight into the podcast after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, Page One, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest, who is another big one.
And the last of the season.
It is the last of the season.
But anyway, enough from us. On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the 3rd act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop, so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy, and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, Whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story, we truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
I think you started as a film editor first, is that right? Before you got into writing?
I was a video editor.
Right, okay.
Yeah, a TV editor, I guess. Film editor sounds very grand. Sounds like I'm working with Scorsese and somewhere, splicing, stuff like that. I worked in TV. I made tea a lot.
Right.
And I was an assistant editor on less than minimum wage in Soho.
Oh, brilliant.
For a while. And then I worked on a lot of documentaries mostly. So a lot of kind of weather documentaries, that stuff. The fastest winds on Earth. We're about to rip apart their trailer home. Did quite a lot of that.
Brilliant.
And I did a lot of music videos, live music. So multicam stuff, concerts and awards shows, things like that. So I worked for Iron Maiden quite a bit. And
That's cool.
The Brit Awards for a while and stuff of that kind. Yeah. So that was how I began in the workplace, I guess you might say.
And while you were doing that, did you always harbour an ambition to write stories, or how did you take that diversion?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was a very keen reader as a kid, and read an awful lot of fantasy and played a lot of role-playing games and was very into the whole world creation and so on. And so I always had a lot of ideas for what I might do with a fantasy epic. Mm-hmm. I suppose I got a bit frustrated with the kind of commercial fantasy of the 80s and 90s, which I've read a huge amount of and loved, but started to find quite repetitive and kind of predictable. And I was reading in other genres, noir and westerns and literary and classics and all sorts of stuff. And, started wondering why there wasn't more shocking, more character-led, more kind of interesting work being done in fantasy. Of course, there was. It's just I wasn't reading it because I had no access to fandom or to the internet or any of those things. Hadn't happened yet. So I kind of wandered away from fantasy, but I always had these ideas of writing fantasy myself. And I had a sort of abortive effort at it when I was 20. I finished my college degree and I did a psychology degree, so I had no education, no skills, no marketing skills. And I thought I'd teach myself to touch type. And the way, once I'd worked out roughly where the keys were, I thought, man, I'm going to write my brilliant fantasy epic as a kind of training exercise, if you like. And it was really bad, really cheesy, really obvious, all the things I didn't really like. And so I went away and I worked as a TV editor for a while and came back to it some years later. I think, I was lucky as an editor in that I was freelance. I might work 40 weeks a year in a busy year. And so I had all this time off. And I started feeling it would be good to have some valuable, worthwhile project, to put my time into. And something that I had ownership of, because as an editor, you're a bit like a plumber.
Yeah.
You come in, but it's not your sink. You appreciate it, but it's never your bathroom. So I wanted to own the bathroom, if I'm stretching the metaphor slightly. And I thought, I'd try my hand at the writing thing again. And this time around, I suppose I was in my 27, 28, something like that. And I just learned to take myself and the genre altogether a lot less seriously. And it had straight away a kind of tongue-in-cheek tone to it that was just much more interesting to me. And so straight away I felt like, there was something worthwhile in what I was doing and became interested in doing it for its own sake, really, as much as anything.
So the first book that you had success with was The Blade itself. Was that the first one that you wrote at that stage of, when you'd taken that and you approached it? Yeah,
I mean, it was the same one I'd written all those years ago in many respects. It was the same characters, it was the same world, it was even the same scenes, but the voice and the kind of feel of it was totally different. It was partly having, spent time as an editor and the experience of working with directors and working with, script guys, good writers there. Partly I'd read Game of Thrones in the meantime and seen kind of a lot of what I felt had been missing from fantasy, expressed there, the character focus, the kind of shocking twist, the gritty take on the world. And partly I'd just kind of grown up a bit and lived life a little bit and sort of was just, I think, writing what I wanted to write more than what I kind of felt I was expected to write, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same book, but it was, kind of the first book I wrote, but also, I spent quite a few years on it, maybe 3 or 4 years, kind of going over and over and over it before trying to find a publisher.
And then what was the process at that point? Because am I right in saying it took about a year to get the book signed by someone? So did you have an agent then, or did you do it solo? What was your path?
One that I would not recommend to anyone. I think the way I always put it is it's like being struck by lightning, isn't it? Getting someone who's interested in your book, finding someone who's interested in your book. But the more you run around naked in the rain, the quicker lightning will strike you. There are things you can do. So I kind of did what the standard advice was at the time, just before email, if you can believe that. It's hard to imagine a world without email. I think they did have email, but it was like, I think our office had one account between everyone in it. It's like, the office email account.
Changed days.
So nothing was done by email in the book trade. You'd send off your sample chapter or whatever it might be. But what I did was I read through the Writers and Artists Yearbook, which was what was advised at the time, and found half a dozen agents who seemed to represent my kind of thing and similar authors, that sort of stuff. And, rang them up and asked who the right person was to send it to and all the stuff you're supposed to do. And then you'd send off your little manila envelope with your 50 pages in, and you'd put in it a self-addressed envelope in which they could return it when they had rejected it.
Like another world.
The ultimate insult. You not only get rejected, but you pay for them to send it. So... I sent off maybe 6 of these, and each one would take 6 weeks, kind of thing. You'd send it off. You'd wait for the reply, and then one day you'd come home and you'd see your own envelope on the mat and know that you had been, rejected again. And it wasn't some hideous veil of sorrows that many writers do go through, much more intense period of rejection, I'm sure. I mean, I got through maybe half a dozen agents, all the ones that were on the list anyway. One of them asked to see some more and then rejected it. All the others just rejected it instantly, and with a level of kind of anonymous lack of feedback that was quite crushing. I was expecting to strike powerful emotions, and I was expecting, no, we reject this because it's too much for us. It's too edgy. It's too funny. It doesn't suit us. The market cannot take something so extreme. But no, it's more just like, you get
just a form rejection, yeah.
We apologise, but this pamphlet / leaflet / short story / it's not appropriate for us at this time, but may or may not be at some future time for us or someone else. Signed, stamp.
Yeah.
Jim, stamp. And so it was just no feedback, no idea whether it was kind of in the ballpark or not, whether it was terrible or good or, just no idea. And so I was starting to think about writing something different, something more focused and self-contained than a huge sprawling trilogy as your first project. Never seems like that great an idea, really. And then a friend of mine who was worked at an educational publisher at Heinemann, he happened to be on a desk editing course with this woman, Gillian Redfern, who had started as an assistant editor at Glance, as it happens. And having found out what she did, he knew that I was doing this, and he kind of said, oh God, a friend of mine has written a thing in your kind of area. Would you like to look at the thing? And she's like, oh God, all right, I'll look at the thing. I think she was new enough that, she hadn't realised how bad these things usually are.
Yeah.
So I was lucky. And she looked at it, and I got an offer 2 weeks later.
Wow.
That. So, lightning struck.
It is amazing. The number of people we've spoken to on this podcast and how few of them have got a publishing deal in the sort of conventional way of here's an agent who is then sold it onto a publisher. There seem to be very lots of different routes to actually getting a publisher.
Yeah.
Yeah. And more than ever these days, I think, probably.
Would you think now with the advent of email, etc., I'm trying to think if it's easier or harder to get an agent or like a publisher now, but I'm assuming with email, agents, etc., are getting so many more submissions than they were when you had to send stuff by post. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for folk trying to get
yeah, an agent will obviously have a much better idea because it's now 15 years since this was happening. It's 16 years even.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole world is radically different. You've got self-publishing,
Yeah.
I don't think the digital aspect of it makes a lot of difference because in a way the bottleneck is the attention of the agent or
That's
the reader
true.
or whoever's
That's
looking
true.
at it. So, the stuff would be posted into them at a certain pace and, you wouldn't get it back for 6 weeks because it takes them 6 weeks to get through that heap of stuff they happen to have in the slush pile at that time. So I doubt that's changed hugely. I mean, I think fundamentally agents are still looking for manuscripts. There's still plenty of agents around, and publishers still want content probably more than ever, if anything. And obviously self-publishing is a sort of parallel garden in which things are growing and flourishing and perhaps moving on to be published, and other people are leaving publishing to self-publish, so the two are kind of some give and take between the two. So I think that's the big change in a sense. At the time the idea of self-publishing was virtually impossible. It would mean printing a load of paperbacks and then trying to get a rep to get them in the book
go around shops and
that whole ecosystem is kind of gone now. Really. Publishers barely even have kind of local reps anymore, who were such an important part of the whole book trade at that time. Now it's an algorithm to Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
That human element has sort of gone out of the trade up to a point.
That's true.
But fundamentally, it's much the same. It's kind of people trying to read the market and see whether the stuff they're being sent is going to sell. So it's just that individual, the time of the eyeballs of the agent or the reader, and whether you happen across the desk of someone who likes your stuff. I think basically it's the same deal.
Yeah, and as you said, you conceived of that as a trilogy. And did you say when you sold it, did you get a 3-book deal at that point in time?
Yeah. And I mean, it was a big 7-figure deal. I'm including the pence columns, which is what I usually do. Makes it sound more impressive. And not life-changing sum of money. So it was a great, a very good deal. It's a decent deal for a first book and everything. But it was for a trilogy. The first one was written. The second one was kind of halfway through. And at that point, I had to actually finish a proper treatment, which I'd never really done.
Mm-hmm.
I had obviously ideas for where it was going and how it was going to finish, and I was, pretty well along with that, but I never really codified it and written it down. So it was actually quite a useful exercise to have to say, okay, this is what's going to happen now. And so it was halfway done, and I've obviously worked with Gillian, who became my editor and has been my editor ever since, on tightening it all up and getting that first one ready. And it was maybe a year and a half till the first one came out. And by that time, I think the third one was probably halfway written.
Right.
So I had that luxury of kind of revising the whole thing, knowing where it was going, which I think was vital.
I mean, I was saying to Tarek actually just before he joined that you're quite unique almost in a modern fantasy writer, in the sense that you've been so prolific and your stories are finished. You're getting to the end of these things, whereas
You're cursing me now. This is the text.
Exactly, but I mean, it sounds like you just accepted, right, I have to get these books out, one a year in this trilogy, and that's just what's going to happen. And that didn't scare you or give you any difficulty in that.
I mean, I guess, I was lucky in the sense that I was half a book ahead by the time the deal was signed, and we knew there'd be a long period before even that first one came out. So, as I say, by the time the first one came out, the second one was well underway. It was finished, and the third one was well underway.
Mm-hmm.
And also with a trilogy, in my experience, I'm sure they all vary, but you get faster as you go through. So the first one, where you're setting up the world and the characters and kind of working out what you're doing, takes much, much longer than the other two do. that was my experience with this recent trilogy as well. So, you know, there wasn't a question about getting the first 3 books ready to put out yearly, because they were pretty much there already. And, you know, there was no anticipation or expectation in the marketplace. It wasn't like there were readers screaming for the next book. They weren't even screaming for the first book. They were screaming not to have the next book. So there wasn't much sense of pressure. And I'm quite a workman-like kind of tunnel-visioned. I try not to think of writing as some kind of magical fairy exercise where, you know, I lay on my fainting couch waiting for inspiration to strike me. Obviously, I do have a fainting couch. But, I've always tried to think of it as quite a banal workman-like process where you break it down into stages and you do each stage, and, you know, the book's made of chapters and the chapters are made of paragraphs and the paragraphs are made of words, and you do one word at a time and you get there in the end. So it was never an issue for me that with that first trilogy, with the next book, it was a bit of a problem, because that was kind of my difficult second album, if you like. The 4th book, it's called Best Served Cold, and it was a standalone book in that same world. And I had assumed I'd just get faster and faster. I think the 3rd book had taken me maybe 14 months to write. So the yearly thing was a bit of a cheat, because I had a head start, you know. But I then had kind of the head start had more or less run out by that point, by the time the 3rd one was published. And so I then had to think up something new characters, new stuff. And obviously the character in the previous one had been with me for decades, in a sense, stewing and developing. I didn't really realise that until I started writing a new one, and they just weren't there. You know, and these new people were unfamiliar strangers I knew nothing about, and their voices didn't come naturally, and it was like typing the gloves on. You know, just that was when I found I had a big panic and thought, well, basically I've written a trilogy and that's great, but now I'm screwed and I'll never write anything else. And, you know, that feeling has kind of persisted ever since, but I've just learned that happens every time you write a book. And that's just how it feels. And so knowing that's how it feels a bit less horrible.
And what's a normal writing day for you then? You know, you've got your deadline, and you've got this fear that you're not going to be able to write anything on both ends, kind of closing in on you. And what do you do to smash through that?
Well, deadlines are a bit of an odd one for me, because generally I have been lucky. I mean, with this most recent project, there wasn't really a deadline in that sense. We kind of said, I'm going to write the whole thing first, because I feel that's the only way to do the best job of a trilogy I can. And I'd rather have a break, you know, although that's obviously a bit difficult to sell to publishers and booksellers, because they're always, where's the next thing, and that's very much the tone of the industry, really. So, you know, it can set you back a little to have that break, but I felt it's better to do that and then have all 3, and then know you've got all 3 there, and they can be prepared and published in whatever schedule suits you, because with Best Served Cold, we kind of got 6 months out or 8 months out and realised not quite going to hit the date, I need another couple of months, and so we moved it back a couple of months, and that's a bit annoying. You know, it's not great to kind of move it a bit near the end. It's better to know exactly when it's going to be and tell everyone when it's going to be and plan it all very carefully and give the book the best chance you possibly can. If you're going to go all the trouble of writing the bloody thing, you might as well give it the best chance you can commercially, right? So with these 3, it was more a case of, you know, I'll write the whole thing and then I'll let you know. I'll get back to you in 3 years when I've written it, and we can talk about publishing it. And that's more or less what happened. I mean, it was 2.5 years or so to get a very rough draft together. And I talk to my editor all the time anyway, and we look at each part as I go. So she'd seen it all as it was going through, and a lot of editing had been done in a way already. And so we then just decided what would be the best time and the best schedule to publish it, which is yearly. And so we just decided, right, each September we'll put the book out. And so that took a lot of the immediate pressure of deadline out, if you like. And I think in general that's how I've tried to write. I mean, with the previous set of books, Half a King, Shattered Sea books, the first of which was Half a King, I wrote that book first, and then sold it after. So, I mean, obviously you're in a luxurious position if you can afford to do that. but it's better if you can, I find, because it's also easier to sell a finished thing than to kind of sell the house off plan, if you will.
Yeah.
You want to be able to show the people around, see how the light falls on the carpet. You don't want to just say, well, it'll be great, believe me, it'll be great. I love it.
The greatest house ever, yeah.
The greatest house ever, exactly. But so, I mean, typical writing day, I suppose it depends on what phase of the project you're in, because I do a lot of revising and going over and editing. Mm-hmm. So half the work's kind of the first draft, I guess you might say. And for that, I'm generally trying to do 4 or 5 hours a day, maybe less. I mean, I aim at kind of 1,500 to 2,000 words in a day. That's a good day. And at the start of these last 3 books, I was doing kind of 1,000 to 2,000 a day. Towards the end, I was getting up to maybe 15,000 a week. I was really rolling along. And I wrote the second 2 books in a very rough and shabby manner. But in a year, both of them took about a year between the 2, which is very fast.
That's very fast, yeah.
They need a lot of work after that. They needed at least as much again to kind of get them.
But the bones of the book were there to work from.
Yeah, and there was a draft.
Yeah.
There was a bad draft. And the bad drafts aren't that bad. They're actually probably 3/4 the same as the finished thing. Mm-hmm. I really just cut down a lot and rewrite and rethink. So I added a few scenes here and there as well, but generally it stayed reasonably close. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you sit and type, if you're typing something that's written down, you can type at a stupendous speed. The typing is not the bottleneck. It's the kind of just the effort,
the mental thinking,
the attention. I find I can't do more than 3 or 4 hours in a day. Is like I'll be pretty battered after that.
And do you like in the next day? Do you go back and look over what you wrote the day before and then revise that as you go, or do you just sort of try and push through to the end?
I used to.
Right.
So with my first book, that's exactly what I did, and I'd be constantly going over and over things. So I'd write a paragraph, I'd read over it, I'd shuffle it all around, reorder it, cut it down, rethink it, think about the voice of the character and redo it. And then I'd move on to the next paragraph and I'd do that one. Then I'd go back to the first one. Yeah. And every day I'd reread what I'd done the previous day. And I think that was all, partly the experience of being an editor. That's what you do. You go over and over stuff. You assemble things, and then you chop them down, reorder, they reorganize. So it's a real process of whittling down and rethinking constantly. So I kind of naturally started to write the same way. And that was important in sort of working out how it worked and what my style was, if I've got one, and how the whole thing works. But it's not very efficient, was what I discovered. And so over time, more and more, I just smash out a first draft without worrying too much. Sometimes I even leave holes in it, which is very bad form, but it just can't be asked. Describing stuff, I'm great on dialogue and I'm fine on action, and that kind of comes reasonably naturally to me. But then I do loads of dialogue and I end up with these holes in between where you've got to say what's going on and describe
Do you
things.
just put like a placeholder or not even bother, just jump forward?
Sometimes I do. Write a little message to future Joe.
Yeah, exactly.
Future Joe, sort this bit, really lavish description of a canal. Great. And then move on. But I think in a way I've learned that if you smash through to the end of a draft, then you obviously then know what you've got and what you're doing, and where you've gone wrong and where you've gone right, and you can apply that knowledge much more efficiently then when you sort of do rounds of revision that are a bit more focused.
Yeah.
So I tend to just smash through a first draft, and then when I've got a part, I split books in at parts. This trilogy was 9 parts altogether, and so I sort of thought about it as 9 parts, and when I finished one, I'd revise that and sort of see where I was and probably cut a lot out and, revise and rethink a bit. And also I'd then have ideas of, okay, well, I've gone a bit wrong with that character. They need to be a bit more selfish, or they need to be a bit more unselfish, or whatever it might be. You steadily build up ideas of what's worked and what hasn't, so that when you tackle the next part, you're a bit more informed. And that's kind of the process I've worked out over time.
So it almost sounds like when you're writing a trilogy, do you almost kind of write one massive book then, and then work out which parts will go in which book and how many parts should be in each book and how you'll split it up, almost once you've kind of done the whole thing?
I mean, it depends a bit. So the Shattered Sea books were linked single books, really, with different characters. And so I did just write them as 3 individual books, although I had some ideas of threads that had run through.
Yeah.
This latest trilogy, I did write really as one big thing, although it was kind of on my mind that it was 3 parts, 3 acts. And so you do want some kind of threads that you want some closure and some sense of arcs within each of those parts, which is kind of a lesson I learned from my first trilogy, where the first book really is just a meandering kind of mess. Brilliantly written, of course, wonderful characters, but a mess. From a narrative standpoint, it has no closure. It doesn't really do anything. It sets everything up and makes no effort to really close anything off, and some readers bounce off that. So I think I've got a bit better at kind of giving each book its own structure. So you're kind of designing the thing with a bit of ebb and flow to it. But certainly I wanted to write the whole thing in one block, because what I didn't want to do is get to the end of the 3rd book and think, I really need to change the start for this character.
I've always thought that must be quite a hard thing when if you do it in step by step to get to book 3 and think, oh crap, I need to change book 1, but it's too late now, and I've written myself into this corner where I can't get out of.
Well, exactly, which is what I didn't want to do. And you're bound to have those feelings. I mean, I'm quite into shapes and patterns and circles and the end repeating the beginning and fancy things of that kind. I mean, I write about magic swords, but still I can do it in a clever way. So I thought I had to really write the end before going back to the start. And my experience with writing standalone books was that often it wasn't until I got to the end that I'd even really know what characters needed to be like. And so the experience there, I mean, with Better Served Cold, particularly the one that I found very difficult, I was thinking, this is terrible, this is rubbish, it makes no sense. And then I got to the end, and as I was getting to the end, I started to think, okay, hold on. I think I know what I've got to do now to make it work at the start. Yeah. So I think with a big trilogy, I had the same feeling. It's like, where are the characters going to end up? Because until you know where they're ending up, you don't know where they need to start, who they need to be. It's all about kind of calibrating how they are throughout the story, so it all makes sense. So in this case, it was conceived of and written as one block, but in 3 acts, I suppose.
And this latest trilogy, which is the Age of Madness trilogy, the second one, the Trouble with Peace, has just come out. But one thing that struck me as I read it is that it seems to be taking themes that are actually very current, but putting them in a fantasy setting. So the idea of sort of industrialization of that world and people losing jobs and all that sort of stuff, which is obviously a parallel with what is happening now in terms of AI and things like that. When you write stories like that, are you wanting to do more than just tell a story, I suppose? You're wanting to bring in some stuff like that.
I write about magic swords as a metaphor for the depth of the universe. Exactly, well, I try not to, I don't know, it depends with every book. I try not to kind of make theme the first thing, if that makes sense, I suppose. I focus mostly on character and story, so what I'll be working out first is, thinking about first is who are the people in it, who are the characters, and what's the overall action and what's going on in the world, and how will the stories of the characters kind of knit into that, if you like. So it's about story first and character. And then, theme, obviously, you hope develops as you go. And sometimes that's kind of natural and obvious within the context. So The Heroes is a war story, but it's about heroism. Is it possible? Is it real? What is it? Who are heroes and who are villains? Is it being a very successful killer? Does that make you a hero? Is it doing the right thing even when it's difficult? Is it, having the right motives even when you do the wrong thing? So it was all about, it became a sort of investigation of what is heroism within the context of a war story, which I guess is a very classic thing for a war story to do. With these books, I think The Age of Madness, naturally, the sort of political upheaval of recent times just finds its way in there. I mean, in the first books, in the First Law, they were written between 2001 and 2005, I guess, 2006, and the third book came out in 2008 in the global financial crisis. And of course, the villain is an evil banker. Simon Profit.
Suspicious.
Absolutely.
What did you know that everyone else didn't, Joe?
Well, I guess, it's an instinctive thing. I just tap into the zeitgeist. What can I say? So with these new books, it became about politics a little bit and the kind of crazy political period we're going through and have been going through for a while. But also, you don't necessarily want to make them the absolute focus of what you're doing, because I think people get a bit bored of totally obvious allegory,
Yeah.
So hopefully they got something to say, but as a secondary to the magic sword stuff.
And there's a lot of humour in the books, which is kind of unusual, I think, for a genre which often takes itself very seriously. And is that something that's important to you, to bring that humour into it that you don't really get in, say, Game of Thrones?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it is. I suppose, after the fact, when people have read your stuff and it's been out a long time and you've kind of read every reaction under the sun, more or less, at one time or another, people start to say similar things, and then you start to think, yeah, that is what I was doing. I was deconstructing
intentionally, yeah.
tropes. I was trying to write a gritty yet humorous take on the classics of fantasy, and you start thinking that was a master plan, and it wasn't really. It was just kind of what happened when I put pen to paper. And the first version I was talking about that I wrote when I was 20 was quite pompous and ponderous and kind of taking itself seriously. And I think in an early scene, the hero tears his bare skin from his chest and steps into a waterfall and is washed clean. Something like that. And then in the kind of more modern version, he kind of stumbles in, he falls over and he cuts his head and it's all a big mess, and I suppose that was what had changed in between. I just found that I had this tongue-in-cheek attitude to it.
Mm-hmm.
Both serious and not serious. I suppose it's just like the humour of how people are, in a way, and when people talk to each other, what emerges. So it's not trying to be funny. I guess fantasy, tended to imitate Tolkien a lot in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And, magnificent though he is in many ways, he's not really a humorist, I think I'd say. It's not what he was going for. But in imitating him and his mythic weight, a lot of fantasy became quite ponderous and pompous and self-seriously, while being quite silly at the same time. Or it was out and out slapstick, of the Lord of the Rings type. And so I kind of wanted to do something that was, serious but had a bit of wit in it, I guess. And it's just what emerged when I was writing and what felt, good and an interesting tone to me. I suppose I was just writing how it felt natural and how I wanted to read, and writing what occurred to me at the time. And a lot of that was quite ridiculous in one way or another.
And when you're writing a fantasy novel, I suppose it's like a sci-fi novel as well. When you're creating a whole world, it can be challenging not to just sort of do an exposition dump of here's what the world's like, here's what the kingdom's been like for 500 years, and how does it come naturally to you just to try and just drop these pieces of information in, or is that sometimes a struggle? Do you think, how am I going to explain what this is here?
As you know, Zarquan, this is the Magic Valley.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. Defeated the orcs in the year 1526. yeah, I know what you mean. It is a problem, and the kind of, I think my first book, certainly, there's a lot of thumbprints of kind of trying to set stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even from right at that point, I was quite into the whole notion of, launching in media res and kind of only describing stuff. I think probably just instinctively, without really thinking about it, it was to the characters who are naturally in their habitat. It's not, they don't describe it. I mean, when you wake up in your own room, you don't go, here I am waking up, and my ceiling's white, and there's my cupboard, and look at there's 6 different toothbrushes in the toothbrush. That's the one I use for holidays, and that's my electric one. You don't think like that. You just sleepwalk through it. But if you wake up and you're in an unfamiliar room, then it's all leaping at you.
Yeah.
So, the experience of that would be very different. So I suppose, I naturally ended up just not really setting things up mostly for the characters when they're in their natural surroundings, but when they're moved out of their natural surroundings and become a fish out of water, that's when, you get a much more interesting reaction to what's around them and the opportunity to describe it in a slightly different way. So I tried to avoid too much of that. And I think, generally speaking, world building is not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
If I've got a thing, I'm less interested in that. And if it's a case of, the effort put into getting my list of kings just so, and the effort put into making a scene pop, then there's no contest as far as I'm concerned. Because in the end, the world building is just the sets. And, no one ever went to a play and said, well, the acting was poor and the direction was poor and the script was terrible, but man, those sets were stupendous. So 5 out of 5. They don't really do that. The sets are never the thing. So I think people get, naturally, the thing that separates fantasy from other stuff, or epic fantasy from other stuff, is the magic and the world and the secondary world and the magical towers and big ships or whatever it might be. But I'm more interested in the stuff it has in common with everything else, the characterization and the humour and the action and the plotting and those things. So I always wanted the world to feel secondary and perhaps, lightly brushed, lightly sketched in, let's say, using a lot of real world analogues that make your lifting light and easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This place sounds like it's got an Italian name, so now I'm thinking Italian. That kind of very sophisticated.
Because there's a lot of fantasy books you get, and it's there's like maps at the start, there's family trees that go on for pages and pages, and you do find yourself I find myself at the start, I'll go back and well, that's so and so's son, right? Okay, and then after about 3 or 4 chapters, you think I can't be arsed, I'm just going to leave it, and you can't keep track anymore, and you can't, and so I think I can see the benefit of just avoiding that entirely, just saying, what, you'll know enough that you need to know to get on with the story, and we're not going to drop you in the middle of this massive family that you need to learn everyone's name and everyone's place and where the people are living in relation to someone else, etc. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
The map's the classic one, isn't it? I mean, I would happily have put a map in had the publisher wanted one, but the guy who was running the imprint at the time, Simon Spanson, he just wasn't into maps particularly. He just felt like it was something people stuck at the front of a book just as a way to say, this is that kind of book you like, with the map.
Yeah, exactly.
And it should work without it. And I don't know, I guess I felt that I wanted to tell a story that was very much focused on the characters and character-centered, and put you in the heads of the characters in the way that things like LA Confidential and stuff that I'd read did. And the map was the opposite. If I wanted to tell a story in tight close-up and not be about the big mountains and the big setting, then a kind of wide shot of the entire world as the very first thing you come to seemed like exactly the wrong message. Apart from which, with a map, there's always those blank bits that you've not really thought about. That you then have to, what do? Do you leave them blank, or do you have to fill them in now with unconvincing stuff you've just thought of on the spot?
Exactly.
You think, damn, that river's totally the wrong shape now. There's an obstacle. So it suited me to just leave the maps out in many ways. And then, of course, I broke my own rule and had loads of maps in the next book. I had on the cover.
But as you write more and more stories in that world as well, it becomes a bigger and bigger thing, obviously, and the more and more characters. I mean, are they all just in your head, and you don't, or do you have a document where you've got everyone noted down and who they are, or is it just kept in your head?
It's mostly in my head. I mean, I've got a timeline of sort of. I've got some historical timelines of various countries, and I do actually have a list of kings and reigns of various kinds, I will admit. Though I try not to mention it very often, either in the book or outside of it. And I've got maps because you kind of have to have maps in order to give a sense the world's concrete and that it makes sense. Especially when you're writing something like The Battle and the Heroes, because everyone's in the same valley over quite a concentrated period of time, the geography becomes quite important in planning how it's all going to work. But generally, I don't have kind of big lists of characters and things, partly because it's so complicated. I don't know what list you'd have that kind of make any sense. Because where I tend to make mistakes that then have to be corrected later is things like relationships between characters. I forget that they knew each other, or that they had that particular conversation, or they ran into each other that time. And so I don't know what form you'd keep that information where you'd be made aware of that naturally.
Yeah.
The only way I've discovered to do it is just to read them all. So when I finished the first draft, one thing that I did in getting to a second draft was I read everything, read the other 6 books and the short stories, just to make sure I hadn't missed anything, or got something wrong, or I have on occasion got things wrong in a draft I've later corrected. So just reading them afterwards is the main thing I do, really. Obviously, as the more books there are, the more weighted stuff there is. But luckily, people die, and you get new generations, so you don't have to worry about all the dead ones.
And also, surely now fans are putting stuff up on Wikipedia, so you can go and just look. You could reference that instead.
You can't trust them to get it right.
No, that's true. Yeah.
No, you can't trust those guys.
Well, I mean, how are the fans? Do you find the fans that if you ever meet them or chat to them and stuff, are they quite nice? Because I think, especially nowadays,
he's not going to say no to that, is he?
No, I know. The fans are the most lovely people I've ever met. Yeah. But you do kind of get that toxic element to fandom, which you see in Star Wars, Game of Thrones, etc. And is that something you've ever encountered yourself?
Well, I don't really like the word fans, because my readers are drawn to me because of a high intellectual level.
Of course.
Not some kind of unreasoning adoration for a meaningless property, meaningless IP. They're intellectuals, man. I don't know. They're generally really good. I suppose it's too small a thing to have that level. There's a kind of perhaps a critical mass level where any given fandom begins to eat itself to a degree, and you get all splinters within it, and people who love one book and hate another book and despise the way the author's gone, all that stuff has only really happened to me in miniature. I mean, there's a subreddit on Reddit for the First Law that has kind of 8,000 subscribers. I mean, there's other books that have hundreds of thousands, so it's not huge, but it's big enough that people can really dislike stuff. It doesn't have to be that big for that to happen.
Do you tend to go in and read it, or do you?
Yeah, I stop by from time to time. Yeah. What people are saying. I think it's kind of important to know how people react to things, because it's part of the process of the post-mortem of a book, and asking yourself whether it was successful, what worked, what didn't. Not to say that you slavishly, when someone says, I hate that character, you think, oh no, I must never write that character again. I must text them all out of my author copies. You just... But sometimes things that readers say kind of you agree with, and you think, yeah, maybe I could have done that better. That's something to think about next time. So it's all part of the process, the reading reviews and reading what people say. And generally, one thing I'm quite pleased with is no one tends to agree on which is my best book. They tend to, there's quite a good spread of opinion on which ones they like and which they don't. And there's always people who, the thing you learn quite early on is that you'll just hear every opinion imaginable.
Yeah.
Kind of blows your mind. When I was young, I thought, we all pay lip service to the notion that everything's subjective. But there is actually objective truth, and it's basically my opinion. That was what I genuinely felt that. Yeah, you like such and such, but you're wrong because it's shit, and I know better. But when you publish something yourself, you do realise actually what is black to one person is white to another. There's just no agreement on what is funny, what is effective plotting, what's a good ending, what's a bad ending. You'll literally get people. Often now it happens. The more books you write, the more it happens probably. But people will say next to each other. You're looking on Goodreads at the reviews, and next to each other there'll be one saying, without a doubt, undeniably his best book so far, and the next one will be, well, I mean, it's his worst book, isn't it? And so I don't know. You've got to take it all with a pinch of salt. I mean,
but the internet has.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry. I was just going to say. I mean, the internet has served as a it's surely made that whole thing worse. Suddenly everyone thinks their opinion is the most important and wants to tell everyone about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the internet has just meant that everyone now can voice their opinion. Opinion is not in short supply. We may be running short of some things, but opinion will never be one of them. And, you know, they're just everyone has equal weight to their opinion as well often. So it's hard to filter out the noise and sort of think about what might or might not be an important opinion and what might not be.
Yeah.
It has changed, and, you know, I'm kind of glad that I came up at a time before Twitter and before, you know, there were chat rooms maybe just starting off, but they were pretty niche. So you didn't get this kind of instant onslaught of opinion about books that can quite quickly turn and become very unpleasant. I think to be a new author in this climate would be really quite worrying. Not, you know, I'm sure yours will be great. Did pretty well, but you know, I think it's a different time where it can be worrying having that kind of, you know, onslaught of opinion potentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm established enough now that, you know, if that happened, I'd probably just, you know, it would be unpleasant, but I'd get over it. It wouldn't damage me significantly. But it certainly is a bit of a worrying time for people making content of one kind or another. Well, a lot of very dug-in kind of political positions that make it very hard. I mean, with the Age of Madness, I was expecting some people might or might not like certain elements of its message or its politics or whatever. I did not anticipate the pro-children down coal mines lobby. You know, there's a real people who are literally, you're being unpleasant about capitalism. And I thought, like, red in tooth and claw Victorian capitalism, orphans down chimneys and that, was not a tough target. That seemed like low-hanging fruit to me. No, there are people who are very, very annoyed that you might criticise capitalism. And all that.
Yeah. I mean, you'll just find people. You just find, as you say, every opinion is out there, and they will make themselves heard. So you can't avoid it now, I suppose, can you?
No, I suppose, you know, the thing is, I suppose you can avoid it in a way.
Well, as you can, you just don't have to. You just don't engage with this, but at all, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, though, if you're very well established, if you're George R. R. Martin or whoever, let's face it, you can just turn it off. It make no difference, really.
Yeah, your books will sell. You don't need to go out there and make an effort on your own back. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of us want to be, because we love to kind of. It's like hearing someone talking about you through an open door, isn't it? You just got to hear what's said.
Yeah, and you hope it's something nice. Yeah.
Yeah, and most of us, you know, feel like we've got to be out there because, you know, having a Twitter presence or whatever it may be is kind of seen as something that's important in marketing a book these days. So, you know, most of us don't feel that's something we can avoid, but probably you could. It's not as important as we think it is. And it can start to feel like the whole world is Twitter. And I mean, it's not. It's
so true.
Very specific sampling. And the most extreme viewpoints are massively amplified. So, you know, the quiet majority don't have much to say, and when they do, no one's interested in listening because it's not exciting. They want to hear people who are massively excited about things, or even better, who hate them and are furious about it. You know, that's one of the downsides, is that we love controversy and hatred and fury, and whenever anyone's being horrible about a book, I can't. Oh, which book? Which author? Is it me? So that, you know, it is for some reason gripping hearing people be horribly unpleasant about things. I don't know why. It's a real unfortunate part of the human cognition, I think.
Yeah.
And would you want to see the world of the First Law transferred into other mediums, like a game or film and TV or things like that?
I mean, are you asking whether I would like, for instance, to have my books adapted into a massively successful multimedia franchise, netting me millions, if not billions, of dollars and the love and admiration of the world's entire population? No, I'm not bothered.
Or you could have a really badly made adaptation, which, you know, everyone hates, and turns people off your books entirely.
No one thinks of those ones that get cancelled after half a season.
Exactly.
I suppose. Yeah, it would be lovely to see, and, you know, things have happened, things go on, and, you know, I think Game of Thrones has obviously had a big impact and meant there's a lot of people looking for similar content, and have been for a while. So most people writing in that wheelhouse have had some interest at some time or another. And as you say, I think it'd be great to have a brilliant adaptation, probably disappointing and sad to have a really terrible one. But then you can't. You've got to take the chance, because you don't know
absolutely.
what it's going to be like until later.
And if it's crap, well, that's their fault. That's not you handed them gold and they turned it into.
Well, exactly.
That's what
the authors love. There's always a panel of authors, isn't there?
Yeah.
The kind of how you shat on my book panel.
Exactly,
Very good thing. How dare they pay me thousands of pounds and boost my book sales and turn out this turkey. And I got snubbed at the party. Michael Caine wouldn't talk to me or whatever it might be. Yeah, I want to be on that panel.
Well, would you want to write it yourself? Would you ever want to write a TV script yourself or adapt your book or write something for film? Show them how it's done.
I may or may not have done some of that now and again. And it may or may not ever have been filmed, but it hasn't.
Fair enough.
So, yeah, I think I would. I mean, the thing is, it's littered with frustrations whichever way you go. I think if you sell all the rights and step away, there's a sort of purity to that, but it's got to be a bit disappointing seeing them kind of mess it up.
Yeah.
But if you decide to get deeply involved yourself, then it's just a kind of ongoing onslaught of compromises, and it's a very different working on a book where you are as close to the boss as you're ever going to get in any business, really.
Yeah.
You have more or less total creative control as an author, generally. Not over every aspect of the book, not necessarily over the cover or the way it's marketed or so on, but over the words and the internals, you're basically in charge, more or less. And clearly with TV or film, it's a massive ensemble piece, and you have big vested interests who want things their way, and you have a much bigger, broader audience you've got to cater to as well. If a book sells 100,000 copies, it's a massive success. If a film sells 100,000 tickets, it's an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
So, you can't appeal to a niche in quite the same way. You have to have some of that, focus grouping and demographics and all that stuff. You don't have the luxury of artistic purity if you're ever handy.
Yeah.
Well, I know I can't remember now his name, but the guy that sold the Witcher books to, but as the game,
Sapkowski.
Sapkowski. I think he didn't like the direction that the games have gone, but those have been massively, massively successful, and have managed to sell him loads and loads of copies of his books as a result of it. So, even if the adaptation isn't exactly what you had, it can do you a lot of good. Yeah, no, absolutely, and it probably always gives you some sort of bump of interest, even if it's just an announcement saying, "Oh, I sold the rights," and isn't it exciting?
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely creates some interest, but many sort of sink without massive trace as well. So it's not always the kind of huge thing that Game of Thrones or Harry Potter is. Often it's just something that goes on. But it feels as though it's a big badge of honour within the industry. Oh, that person had their thing adapted. Ooh.
Yeah.
Now we can take them seriously. And naturally, when you're talking to people who don't have anything to do with books, they'll always be like, "Oh, have you had anything
That's right.
on the screen yet?" No.
And you've got The Wisdom of Crowds out next year, and that's the final book in the trilogy. And then what's the plan for after that?
Well, the horrible thing, isn't it, about being a writer is there's always another book to write. I mean, that's the problem. As I realised when I was writing, my third book, and my editor suddenly said to me, "What are you doing next?" I just never thought about next. Horrifying epiphany that I might have to write dozens of books. And ever since then, it's been, just waking up.
One book after another.
So there'll be something else, I expect. Probably non-First Law related, because it's good to... I'll almost certainly come back to that world, I think, God willing, but it's nice to try other things and try varied stuff. And obviously I had a stab at young adult with the Shattered Sea thing, so I might have a stab at going more adult than ever.
Erotica?
Well, just onslaught of sex and violence. Almost certainly. That's my thinking. How far can I push it? I did get an email from a guy who said he very much enjoyed the Heroes, but unfortunately he then had to burn it because he was concerned it would fall into the hands of his prayer group and corrupt them. I want to see if I can take them a step down that particular path.
Excellent.
what is the last book that you read?
Funnily enough, the last book I read was Sapkowski.
Oh, okay.
Tower of Fools. He's got, you see, they say he's got a new book out, but actually it was written 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
But it was never translated.
Been translated.
Yeah, so it's just been translated. It's very good, actually, I think. I mean, it's sort of, niche is probably the wrong word, but it's I'm not sure it'll be everyone's cup of tea. It's set in the Hussite Wars, so it's 15th, 16th century Bohemia, and it's kind of very much soaked in that period and full of weird Latin and kind of the vagaries of the Catholic Church.
And what about the last film that you watched?
The last film I watched. It's funny. So much of what I watch these days is TV. I'm having a hard time remembering what. No, I know what it was. It was The Karate Kid.
Oh, we were just chatting about that earlier on today. Yeah. Have you been watching the TV show?
Yeah, exactly.
Cobra Kai.
Yeah. I thought that would be a great thing to watch with the kids. So we managed to twist their arms into watching The Karate Kid, and they loved it. And I actually loved it.
Yeah, we watched it 2 weeks ago to get back into, and I hadn't seen it since I was a kid, and I still loved it. It still holds up. Cheesy nonsense, but it's great.
It's really good. It's a bit kind of harder edged than I remembered it. And Cobra Kai is just such a brilliant.
Oh, it's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah.
The one thing about Karate Kid, I said this to you, Tarek, was that when you watch it again now, you forget what a little shit Daniel was quite a lot of the time. He had quite a lot of it coming. I think, so.
Yeah, they're often a lot more complicated than you remember those 80s films.
Yeah.
And, they just were a bit less inhibited, maybe, in they did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just such an ingenious concept what they've done with it, what they've done bringing it back 35 years later.
It's excellent. Oh yeah, and last one is what was the last TV show that you've been watching?
Well, Cobra Kai, and also I've been watching Community, funnily enough, which I never caught at the time. Sometimes it's nice to have one of those kind of comedy shows with 15,000 episodes that you missed at the time, and I've been really enjoying that actually. I think it's great, and also The Boys.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I've got one episode of that still to watch, but it's also very good. And I just think Anthony Starr playing Homelander is just absolutely.
He's the best thing, and he's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah,
I think he's superb. Funny enough, I'd watched Banshee not long before, which I'd never watched at the time, and I'd watched all that. I think might have watched the first season of The Boys, then I watched all that, and then I watched the second season, and only in the last episode, I thought this guy's so familiar.
Is he the main guy in Banshee?
He's the main guy in Banshee.
Oh, I've never seen Banshee, but I've seen trailers for it and stuff. He seems he's totally different. And,
totally unrecognisable. I mean, unrecognisable. It's such a great performance, Homelander.
Oh,
it's horrible. It's small. It's mean, but it's also very human and kind of the combination of that. With great power comes great responsibility, and no responsibility whatsoever. Just the smallness and the meanness, but brilliant. Detailed, observed little performance. I think it's great.
The last thing we do is an either or, and Tarek will tell you that there are no right answers apart from to one of the questions. So the first one I'll go for is George R.R. Martin or J.R.R. Tolkien.
Well, Tolkien can't give me no blurb, so Martin all the way.
Wise move. And then, well, this won't be quite the same, but Game of Thrones or The Witcher?
Well, I do like both. I think Game of Thrones for me is a kind of foundational influence.
You're really plugging that blurb from Martin.
I know, I do really love The Witcher, though. It's tough.
TV or cinema?
I like both, but lately TV. Yeah.
Real book or ebook?
Generally real, but it's kind of. It's all about. It's just a delivery mechanism, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Yeah, the ebook has its place and time for travel and for fitting books on a device. So why not both?
But if you really had to come down on one side or the other,
real book. Because, I like a big shelf.
Tarek, that was stupid. You pushed it. Exactly. That's the one that always gets Tarek annoyed.
I should just taken the half point and just left it at that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, people buy both, so I'm good with it.
That was foolish, Tarek. You should not have pushed him.
Why did I push him? I should have just taken the half point.
That was a mistake, a big mistake. And actually, have you seen this week? There's another reason that real books should always win out over ebooks, because Amazon are arguing in America that you don't actually ever own these things that you quotes buy off
It's
them.
really interesting. I don't agree with that at all. Like I totally get if you're buying a digital content or a film or a book or whatever, you don't own a physical version of it. But I feel it's disingenuous to call it a buy option.
Mm-hmm.
You're not actually. You're just kind of.
It's like an indefinite hire until they decide that you can't have
Yeah.
it anymore. Essentially.
Yeah, it makes me a bit uncomfortable.
Yep.
So
are you going to come over to real books then?
it's too early for that. I'm dug in this hill. I can't get out.
We'll pull you over. We'll pull you over. But I thought that was a great chat with Joe. He had a lot of funny and interesting things to say there. You know, I thought it was interesting actually. We talked at the start about how he is one of these fantasy writers that actually finishes the stories that he's telling, and he writes them all as one block, you know, these big trilogies, but he chooses to write the whole story, which makes sense when you think about it, because as you said, if you get to book 3, what is meant to be book 3, and you suddenly realise you need to change something, you'd have to go all the way back to book 1 and make the changes flow through the whole thing. So it would be quite difficult, that I think.
I mean, it's a massive undertaking, though. When you think, if you're, fantasy books are quite big to start with, so to think of it in one massive block, you need to be pretty dedicated and to be able to push through that. Because I imagine everyone has those points when they're writing a book where you have that self-doubt, etc. But that must just be magnified tenfold when you're writing it in a oneer like that. But yeah, I suppose maybe that does help with them putting the books out once a year. As we said at the start, how many authors don't have anywhere near that many books, especially fantasy authors. So it's impressive.
No, that's right. And I thought it was interesting what he was saying about theme, because I think maybe I'm looking at the wrong sources and stuff, but to me, you've always got people saying science fiction is an allegory for something, and science fiction can be used as a way to tell, as a commentary on current issues and things like that. But it's not something that is so often thought of in relation to fantasy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And his books definitely do. The Age of Madness trilogy is very much about sort of industrialization and politics and things like that. That is very current, really, a lot of it, but in this fantasy setting. So it's I think that maybe is something that can be dismissed when people talk about fantasy sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. It's something I hadn't thought before. Why is it that science fiction, I think science fiction, fantasy, they're both genres that are unfairly sidelined as we chat next week.
Yes, indeed.
But of the two, I think science fiction does get a pass at being viewed at with these eyes of it's telling a story of our time in a future setting.
It's a piece of commentary as well as just the story.
Social commentary.
Yeah.
You don't get that with fantasy. I don't know why that is.
No, that's right. In the wider public, I think there is this sort of thought of fantasy simply as Lord of the Rings. It kind of just gets put into that category, one little box, and now Game of Thrones, of course, as well. But
whatever big product is out the time.
It's so much wider, and it can tell so many different stories. And if you haven't read Joe's books, I would highly recommend them, because they are great stories. They have really, really great characters, quite broken characters in a lot of ways, but really interesting characters, and they do have this wider commentary aspect to them as well. So I really appreciate Joe taking the time to come on the podcast. We really enjoyed chatting with him.
Absolutely.
And next week we've got another great guest.
We do. Next week we're chatting with Daniel Abraham, who is one half of James S.A. Corey, who is of course the pen name for the author behind the Expanse trilogies, made into a very successful
Not trilogies, series.
The trilogy series, sorry.
7
or 8 books
9
now.
It will be 9 at the end of it.
We were talking about. I should stop drinking and recording. So it was obviously made into a very successful TV show, and Daniel's also done a number of fantasy books himself as well.
Yeah, so I mean, again, it's a really fascinating and in-depth chat about where these genre stories stand in relation to other types of literature. how they can have an impact that people sometimes don't think, but also how he crafts these amazing worlds and amazing universes and fits everything in a 9-book saga together. You know, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, he talks in depth about all of that, and we also talk about what it's like when someone decides to tell you your book is shit on social media, as we did with Joe there. You know? It's I'm always interested just to hear that. But I mean, the good news is that Joe was quite sanguine about it, and Daniel is as well. You know, I think that's how you have to be, because
I think you'd have to roll with it, otherwise you would just become neurotic and hate people.
Exactly. Well, if you enjoyed the podcast, please do take a minute to give us a quick rating on your podcast app and leave a review if you can, because it really helps us climb the charts, which helps us continue to get these great guests. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.